I never imagined that something as simple as a roof could turn an entire neighborhood against me. But the day the HOA fined me for what they called an ugly eyesore, I realized this was never about safety. It wasn't about broken county codes or real danger. It was about appearances, about matching the look of every other house in Cedar Ridge Estates, a quiet little development just outside Pine Hollow, Colorado. The letter sounded polite on the surface, almost friendly. But underneath it was a threat. Remove the roof or start paying fines. Weekly fines. Bigger fines if I didn't fall in line. Liens if I kept resisting. The HOA president, Melissa Granger, looked me straight in the eye and told me uniformity mattered more than my personal opinions about safety. What she didn't understand was that I didn't build that roof to make a statement. I built it because I had heard a roof fail once before, and that sound never leaves you. I built it so my wife and my kids would never be trapped under one. And when the once-in-a-century blizzard finally hit our town, everyone learned exactly why I refused to back down. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I need to explain why that roof was never negotiable for me, because without that context, it probably sounds like I was just being stubborn. I wasn't. Long before Cedar Ridge Estates, long before Pine Hollow, I spent years working as a structural engineer tied into emergency response and failure investigations. When something collapsed, when people got hurt or worse, my job was to help figure out why. And the truth is, most failures don't happen in dramatic explosions. They happen quietly. Slowly, a little sag here, a groan there, until suddenly there's no warning left. I've stood in frozen yards staring at crushed living rooms. I've walked through homes where the roof gave way under snow that wasn't supposed to be that bad. I've heard survivors say the same thing every time they thought it would hold. That sound, the low, stressed creak of a structure giving up, stays with you. Once you've heard it, you never forget it. So when my wife, Rachel, and I decided to settle down and buy a home, I made one promise to myself that I told her on day one. I said I would compromise on paint colors, flooring, landscaping, even the layout of the kitchen. But the roof would be built my way, not for looks, not for resale photos, for survival. Cedar Ridge Estates looked perfect on paper. Quiet streets, mountain views in the distance, a place where kids could ride bikes without worrying about traffic. The houses all had that same gentle roof pitch, the kind developers love because it looks uniform and clean. I knew immediately those roofs were built for mild winters, not for the kind of storms this region occasionally throws at you when conditions line up just right. So before we even moved in, I redesigned the roof. Steeper pitch. Reinforced trusses rated well above minimum requirements. Standing seam metal instead of shingles, designed so snow couldn't cling and build up. Snow guards placed strategically so weight would release in controlled sheets instead of all at once. No ice dams. No slow accumulation. When snow came, it would slide. Predictably, safely. To me, it wasn't extreme. It was basic risk management. At first, nobody cared. The house got finished and life moved on. Neighbors waved when we walked the block in the evenings. Our kids played tag with other kids from the street. People asked polite questions about the roof, mostly out of curiosity. Trevor Mills, the guy who lived across the cul-de-sac, laughed one afternoon and said it looked like something you'd see on a mountain lodge. I took it as a compliment. He even asked if it actually worked, and I told him it did. Every winter, quietly and cleanly, and for a while, that was that. The snow would come, my roof would shed it with a soft sliding sound, and life would go on. Rachel told me more than once that she liked it, that it made her feel safe. The kids treated it like magic, watching snow disappear while it piled up everywhere else. To us, the roof wasn't ugly. It was reassuring. Everything changed when Melissa Granger took over the HOA board. She arrived with confidence and polish, the kind of person who always looked prepared, always had a clipboard tucked under her arm. Her first email talked about community cohesion and protecting neighborhood standards. It sounded harmless enough, almost friendly. Then, a few weeks later, I got my first violation notice in the mail. It cited aesthetic noncompliance. I assumed it was a mistake. I responded with permits, engineering documentation, and county approvals. A second notice arrived anyway, then a third. This one demanded a redesign plan to bring the roof into alignment with community appearance guidelines. When I asked Melissa directly what the actual safety concern was, she didn't answer the question. She smiled and said county codes weren't the HOA's responsibility. She said the board's job was to preserve a unified look. She said exceptions led to chaos. That was the moment it clicked for me. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't even about the roof. It was about control. My roof was visible proof that someone could say no, build something different, and still be completely within the law. And to someone like Melissa, that was unacceptable. The fines started small, almost polite, like they were testing to see how much pressure it would take to make me bend. A warning fee at first. Then another one a few weeks later. When I didn't tear the roof off or submit a redesign plan, the amount doubled. The letters always used the same careful language, the kind that sounds reasonable until you realize it's backed by threats. Continued non-compliance. Escalating penalties. Possible lien action. When I finally sat down across from Melissa Granger, I brought everything: permits, county approvals, engineering calculations, load ratings that exceeded requirements by a wide margin. I explained calmly how snow behaves, how weight builds, how roofs fail when designers chase looks instead of physics. She didn't even glance at the papers. She leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and said, almost word for word, "County permits don't override HOA authority." Then she added, "This isn't an engineering debate." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. I tried again, explaining that snow load wasn't a matter of opinion, that gravity didn't care about aesthetics. She cut me off and said safety concerns were a personal issue and that the board existed to enforce covenants, not feelings. The way she said it, flat, rehearsed, made it clear she'd practiced those lines. After that, the neighborhood started to change. People who used to wave suddenly found their phones fascinating when I walked by. Conversation stopped when I approached. Rachel noticed it first. Then the kids did. Playdates quietly disappeared. Birthday invitations never came. One afternoon, my older daughter came home confused and upset and asked why another kid at school said our house was bad for the neighborhood. She didn't even know what that meant. She just knew it sounded wrong. That was harder to deal with than the fines. The HOA didn't have to tell anyone to shun us. They just had to create an atmosphere where questioning authority felt risky. People didn't want to be next. I could see it in their faces, discomfort mixed with relief that the spotlight wasn't on them. I decided to address it publicly at the next HOA meeting. I showed up early with 2 thick binders. One was documentation, permits, inspections, approvals. The other was engineering data, snow load calculations, failure photos, thermal images showing how ice dams form on shallow roofs. I wasn't there to argue. I was there to explain. Melissa opened the meeting by reading my violations out loud, emphasizing words like non-compliant and refusal. When it was my turn, I laid the binders on the table and asked the board to look at the facts before voting on further penalties. She didn't touch them. She said the board wasn't qualified to evaluate technical materials and didn't need to be. She said covenants were clear. She said allowing one exception would undermine community standards. When I mentioned my kids, she stiffened and said emotional appeals didn't change written rules. The room stayed quiet. A few board members avoided eye contact. One of them glanced at the binders like he wanted to open them, then looked back down at his notes. No one challenged her. No one asked questions. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Up until then, I'd believed there was a misunderstanding that could be cleared up, that reason, evidence, and calm explanation would eventually win. Sitting there, watching Melissa dismiss facts without even pretending to consider them, I realized reason was never part of the equation. This wasn't a disagreement. It was a test. She wanted to see if I would submit when authority leaned on me, if I would choose peace over principle, if I would quietly undo something important just to make her comfortable. I packed up my binders without another word. As I walked out, I felt the weight of it settle in. This wasn't going to end quickly. It wasn't going to be polite. And it wasn't going to be resolved by hoping someone on the board suddenly grew a backbone. From that point on, I stopped expecting fairness from the HOA, and I started preparing for a fight. After that meeting, sleep didn't come easily. The house felt quieter than usual, like it was holding its breath. I sat at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed, flipping through the HOA covenants again. Not skimming this time, reading every line the way I'd read a failure report, looking for what everyone else missed. That's when I found it. Buried deep in the enforcement section was a clause that clearly hadn't been used in years, maybe ever. An independent review provision. It stated that if a homeowner formally disputed a violation and requested outside evaluation, the HOA was required to pause enforcement and submit the matter to an independent review panel. Not a friendly suggestion, a requirement. I read it 3 times, just to be sure. Melissa hadn't counted on someone who actually read the rules, she loved to quote. The next morning, I submitted a formal request citing the exact clause, paragraph, and subsection. I sent it certified. I sent it by email. I kept copies of everything. Within hours, Melissa replied saying the clause was outdated and not applicable to aesthetic violations. That response alone told me I'd hit something important. I replied once, calmly quoting the covenant word for word. After that, things got tense fast. Melissa tried to delay the process, claiming scheduling conflicts and procedural questions. She hinted that the panel would side with the HOA anyway. She even suggested that pursuing the review would damage community relationships. I ignored all of it. The covenants were clear, and eventually she ran out of excuses. The panel was assembled within the month. It wasn't made up of social climbers or people trying to protect appearances. It was 3 practical professionals. A retired contractor who had spent decades building and repairing homes in this climate. A former zoning official who knew exactly how codes were written and why. And a county-certified inspector who'd spent his career crawling through attics and roofs after storms. From the moment they walked in, I could tell this was different. They didn't smile politely and wait for instructions. They asked questions immediately. They asked about materials, about pitch, about load ratings, about drainage. They wanted to see permits. They wanted timelines. They wanted to understand why the roof was built the way it was. Melissa looked uncomfortable. She opened her presentation with slides about property values and neighborhood harmony, photos of uniform roof lines, charts showing visual consistency. She talked about how exceptions could lead to chaos, how buyers expected a certain look, how rules existed for a reason. No one interrupted her. They let her finish. Then it was my turn. I didn't talk about feelings. I didn't talk about defiance. I laid out data, snow load calculations based on historic storm patterns, photos of ice dams forming on shallow roofs in similar developments, engineering models showing how weight accumulates silently over time. I explained how standing seam metal reduces friction, how controlled shedding prevents sudden failures, how reinforced trusses buy time when conditions get worse than forecasted. The retired contractor leaned forward and asked how often the roof released snow. I told him. The zoning official asked whether the design exceeded county minimums. I showed him where it did. The inspector asked the simplest question of all, whether the roof posed any safety risk to neighboring properties. I answered honestly, it didn't. In fact, it reduced risk by preventing sudden collapses. Melissa tried to interject more than once, steering the conversation back toward aesthetics. Each time she was gently shut down. The panel wasn't rude. They were just uninterested in arguments that didn't matter. At one point, the inspector asked Melissa whether the HOA had reviewed any of this information before issuing violations. She hesitated. Then she said no. That moment changed the room. The quiet that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy. The kind of silence that settles in when people realize something important has just been exposed. Melissa's authority, built on confident statements and absolute language, suddenly looked hollow. The panel asked a few more questions, all technical, all practical. Then they thanked us and said they would issue a written determination. As we packed up, I noticed Melissa avoiding eye contact. She didn't say a word to me. The decision arrived a week later. The violation was dismissed. The fines were nullified. The roof was deemed compliant, safe, and within all applicable standards. The HOA was instructed to cease enforcement immediately. On paper, it was a complete win. But as I read the letter, I didn't feel relief the way I expected. I felt something closer to caution. Because if this had been about compliance, it would have ended there. Melissa didn't lose because the roof was approved. She lost because she'd been proven wrong. And people like her don't handle that quietly. When the decision came in, it was exactly as clear as it could be. The violation was dismissed. Every fine was nullified. The letter stated, in careful but unmistakable language, that my roof was compliant, safe, and fully within both county standards and the HOA's own governing documents. The board was instructed to stop enforcement immediately. On paper, it was over. In reality, it was just beginning. Melissa didn't respond with acceptance or even silence. She responded with escalation. Less than 2 weeks after the ruling, I was served with paperwork. She was suing me personally, claiming my roof had damaged property values and caused ongoing harm to the community. It didn't matter that the independent review had already addressed those claims. This wasn't about winning. It was about punishment. Almost overnight, the atmosphere around our house changed again, only this time it felt darker. Anonymous complaints started showing up with clockwork regularity. One week, it was the angle of my driveway lights. The next week, it was my mailbox. Then it was snow shoveling, even when the driveway was already clear. Each notice was minor on its own, but together they formed a pattern. Someone was watching. Someone was reporting everything. Then I noticed the SUV. It was a dark gray vehicle that started appearing around the same time every afternoon, right when school buses dropped kids off. It never parked directly in front of our house. It didn't need to. It would idle down the block or sit across the street for a few minutes before driving away. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was coincidence. But after weeks of tension, it didn't feel like nothing. Rachel noticed it too. The final line was crossed one morning before sunrise. I walked out to the garage and saw fresh red spray paint smeared across the door and the sidewall. Big, uneven letters. Conform or leave. The paint was still tacky. Whoever did it hadn't rushed. That was the moment the fight stopped being about rules. Rachel didn't argue when I suggested she take the kids to stay with her sister for a while. She didn't want to leave, but fear has a way of cutting through pride. I helped pack bags, trying to keep my voice steady while the kids asked why they had to go. I told them it was temporary. I told them everything would be fine. When the house went quiet after they left, the silence felt heavier than any fine or letter ever had. I didn't retaliate. I didn't lash out. I did what I'd learned to do when situations turned hostile. I documented everything. Photos, dates, times, copies of every notice, video of the SUV when it appeared. reports filed, emails saved in multiple places. I treated it like a slow-moving threat environment, because that's what it had become. Melissa thought pressure would break me. What she didn't know was that I'd already run the numbers. I'd already looked at long-term weather patterns. I'd already seen the forecast starting to converge in ways that made my stomach tighten. The kind of convergence that doesn't happen often, but when it does, it overwhelms everything built on assumptions. A historic storm was forming. The kind of storm that doesn't care about lawsuits, or covenants, or neighborhood harmony. The kind of storm that strips away arguments and leaves only outcomes behind. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that when it arrived, it would settle the argument once and for all. The storm arrived at night, the way the worst ones always seem to. The forecast had warned of heavy snowfall, but by the time the first bands rolled in, it was already clear they had underestimated it. The wind howled like something alive, rattling windows and driving snow sideways so hard it sounded like gravel hitting the house. By midnight, visibility was gone. Streetlights disappeared into a white blur, and the world shrank down to whatever the porch light could reach. The power went out just after 1 in the morning. The house went quiet except for the wind and the steady thump of snow hitting the roof. I sat awake in the dark, listening. Not anxiously, not guessing. Listening the way you do when you know exactly what to listen for. Every structure has a voice under stress. You can hear when weight is distributing properly, and you can hear when something is starting to fail. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it. A deep, strained groan carried through the storm, not from my house, but from somewhere down the street. It was followed by a sharp crack that echoed in a way snow never should. That sound dragged an old memory out of the back of my mind, one I had spent years trying not to relive. I knew exactly what it meant. By dawn, the snow was nearly waist-high in places, sculpted into drifts by the wind. I stepped onto the porch and scanned the neighborhood. Roofs were buried. Some sagged visibly, their lines no longer straight. Others were holding snow like a sponge, thick and unmoving. I could already see ice forming along the edges where heat had melted snow just enough for it to refreeze. Then there was my roof. It stood clean and sharp against the gray sky. Snow slid down in controlled sheets, releasing in sections exactly as designed. No buildup, no strain. Just gravity doing what it always does when you let it. A loud crash cut through the wind. Across the street, the sunroom on the Dalton house finally gave up. The roof collapsed inward, glass shattering and metal bending as the weight overwhelmed it. I saw movement inside, then frantic motion as they scrambled out through a side door. A few houses down, a carport folded in half like wet cardboard, dumping snow and debris onto the vehicle beneath it. The street had become a series of failures in real time. I grabbed my coat and boots and stepped outside, moving carefully through the drifts. People were yelling. Someone was crying. A few neighbors stood frozen, staring at their homes like they were seeing them for the first time. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This wasn't about appearances or property values. This was about structures that either held or didn't. That's when I heard my name. I turned and saw Melissa Granger standing at the end of my driveway. She looked nothing like the confident HOA president who had threatened me with fines and lawsuits. Her coat was unzipped, her hair soaked and plastered to her face. Panic had stripped away every layer of polish she usually wore. She ran toward me, slipping once in the snow before catching herself. "My roof," she said, breathless. The awning collapsed. "The main roof is sagging. I don't know what to do." For a brief moment, everything slowed down. I thought about the letters, the fines, the lawsuit, the paint on my garage. The nights my kids had cried because they didn't understand why neighbors suddenly hated them. I thought about the empty house and the silence that followed when Rachel took them somewhere safe. Then I looked past Melissa and saw her house. The snow load was uneven. One side was holding far more weight than the other. The roofline dipped in a way that told me it was already close to failure. If it went, it wouldn't go gently. I didn't argue. I didn't remind her of anything she'd done. I told her to grab a shovel and follow my instructions exactly. We worked fast, clearing in controlled sections, reducing load where it mattered most. I showed her where to stay clear, where the structure was weakest, where not to stand. Emergency crews were overwhelmed across town. It would be hours before help reached this street. While we worked, more neighbors gathered, drawn by the noise and the reality unfolding around them. Trevor showed up, his face pale, his own roof buried deep under snow. He didn't say much. He just grabbed a shovel and did what I told him. By the time the wind began to die down, Melissa's roof was stable, damaged but holding. No collapse, no injuries. She stood there shaking, staring up at it like she couldn't believe it was still there. Emergency lights eventually flashed at the far end of the street. Fire crews moved from house to house, assessing damage, marking structures that weren't safe. When they reached mine, one of the firefighters looked up, then back at me. "This," he said, nodding toward the roof, "is what smart looks like." Melissa didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The storm had done what no meeting, no lawsuit, and no threat ever could. It had stripped the argument down to the truth. Some roofs fail, and some roofs don't. By the time the worst of the storm passed, Cedar Ridge Estates didn't look like a neighborhood anymore. It looked like a warning. Snow lay in uneven, brutal piles. Rooflines sagged where they were never meant to bend. Debris was scattered across yards, shattered glass, twisted aluminum, splintered beams. The silence after the wind died was heavy, broken only by distant sirens and the low murmur of people realizing how close they'd come to disaster. Melissa stood in her driveway, arms wrapped around herself, staring at her house. The awning over her front entry had already collapsed completely, crushed under the weight. The main roof was scarred and bowed, the snow load uneven where drifting had piled higher than design ever accounted for. Every few minutes, snow slid a few inches and settled again, like the house was breathing under pressure. She looked at me and finally said it, her voice barely steady. She asked if I could help her more. Not as an HOA president, not as someone in charge, just as a homeowner who knew what he was doing. I nodded. Not because I forgot what she'd done, not because any of it was forgiven, but because there are lines you don't cross, even when someone else already has. Letting a roof fail when you know how to prevent it is one of those lines. We worked methodically. I showed her where the structure was weakest, where weight needed to come off first, and where not to stand under any circumstances. Trevor and a couple of other neighbors joined in without being asked. No one talked about rules or covenants anymore. There was no arguing, no posturing, just people trying to keep their home standing. As the morning went on, emergency crews finally reached our street. Firefighters moved house to house, tagging unsafe structures and checking for injuries. When they got to Melissa's place, one of them whistled softly and said she was lucky. Another told her flat out that if the load hadn't been reduced when it was, the roof likely would have failed by afternoon. Then they walked over to my house. They didn't need to climb anything. They stood in the street and looked up. Clean lines. No sag. No ice dams. No dangerous buildup. One of the firefighters called over his lieutenant, who took one look and nodded. He asked who designed it. When I told him, he just said, "You did this right," like it was the most obvious thing in the world. That moment spread faster than any HOA notice ever had. Someone posted drone footage online later that afternoon. Block after block of damaged roofs, collapsed sunrooms, twisted carports, and right in the middle of it all, my house stood untouched, snow sliding off in smooth, controlled sheets like it always had. News crews picked it up before nightfall. They didn't mention my name at first. They just called it the one house that held. Melissa watched the footage from her living room, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the screen. I didn't need to be there to know what that felt like. For years, she'd spoken with absolute certainty. She'd enforced rules without hesitation. She'd dismissed safety as a personal preference. Now, the evidence was everywhere. That night, she sent out an email to the entire neighborhood. It wasn't long. There were no justifications or explanations. She wrote that she was resigning as HOA president, effective immediately. She admitted that mistakes had been made. She said the storm had revealed weaknesses that could no longer be ignored. She didn't mention me by name. She didn't have to. By the next morning, the tone of the neighborhood had shifted completely. People stopped whispering. They started asking questions, real ones, about materials, about pitch, about why so many roofs failed the same way at the same time. Trevor came over and apologized, awkward and sincere, for not speaking up sooner. Other neighbors followed, some quietly, some emotionally. A few admitted they'd wanted to copy my roof years ago but were afraid of being targeted. Melissa didn't come outside much after that. When she did, she avoided eye contact. Not out of anger, but out of something closer to shame. The authority she'd built on rigid enforcement collapsed faster than any awning ever could once reality showed up. The storm didn't just expose structural weaknesses, it exposed character. And when the dust settled, everyone could see who had been right all along. Not because I fought harder, or talked louder, or played politics better, but because I built for truth instead of approval. In the days after the storm, Cedar Ridge Estates felt like a different place. The damage forced everyone to slow down, to stop pretending nothing had happened. Tarps covered half the roofs. Dumpsters lined the streets. Insurance adjusters walked door to door with clipboards that suddenly mattered more than the HOAs ever had. The HOA board went quiet at first. No emails, no violation notices, no threats. Then, about a week later, a message finally went out. The language was different this time. No talk of aesthetics or uniformity. It announced an emergency meeting to review building standards and safety policies in light of the storm. I went. So did almost everyone else. The room was full in a way it had never been before. People weren't there to argue about paint colors or lawn height. They were there because they'd watched roofs fail, because they'd heard the same sounds I had, because some of them had come dangerously close to losing more than property. Without Melissa at the front, the tone changed completely. The remaining board members didn't posture. They asked questions. They admitted they hadn't been prepared for something like this. They acknowledged that the covenants, as written, hadn't protected anyone when it mattered. The first change was immediate, a temporary suspension of aesthetic enforcement for structural repairs. No penalties for materials that differed from the original design. No approvals required for safety upgrades recommended by licensed professionals. For the first time since we'd moved in, the HOA sounded less like an authority and more like a group of neighbors trying to fix a real problem. Over the next few weeks, those temporary measures became permanent. Roof pitch requirements were updated. Standing seam metal was added as an approved material. Snow guards were no longer optional. Language was rewritten to state clearly that safety considerations took priority over appearance. The words were plain and unmistakable. No rule could override life safety. It was the exact opposite of what Melissa had once argued. The physical look of the neighborhood changed too. As repairs began, metal roofs started appearing everywhere, some shiny, some matte, some in colors that would have been unimaginable a month earlier. No one complained, no one sent letters. People asked for contractor recommendations instead. Trevor came by one afternoon while I was clearing snowmelt from the driveway. He didn't ease into it or make excuses. He just apologized. He said he should have spoken up earlier. He said watching the storm unfold made him realize how easily he'd gone along with something that didn't feel right just because it was easier. I told him it was fine, and I meant it. One by one, Other neighbors followed. Some brought coffee. Some brought awkward smiles. A few brought their kids, who immediately ran off to play like nothing had ever happened. Slowly, the street felt human again. When Rachel and the kids came home, the house felt whole for the first time in weeks. The fear that had pushed them away had drained out of the place. My daughters stood in the yard, looking up at the roof like they always had, only this time there was pride in the way the neighbors looked at it too. A month later, I got a call I didn't expect. The county engineering department wanted to talk. They'd reviewed storm damage across the region and noticed a pattern. Certain designs failed repeatedly. Others didn't. Mine was one of the examples that held up under the worst conditions. They asked if I'd be willing to consult on updated winter safety recommendations. I said yes, with one condition: that the guidelines would be clear, practical, and written, so people understood why they mattered, not just what they required. Standing in my driveway that evening, watching snow melt off roofs built smarter than before, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: relief. The fight was over. Not because I'd beaten anyone, but because the truth had finally been loud enough that it couldn't be ignored. I never set out to be the guy who went to war with the HOA. I didn't wake up one day looking for a fight or trying to make a statement. I just wanted my family to be safe in the house we worked hard to buy. Somewhere along the way, that simple goal turned into a battle I didn't ask for, but also couldn't walk away from. What this whole experience taught me is something I wish more people understood. Rules are supposed to protect people, not pride. They're meant to reduce risk, not silence common sense. Uniformity looks great on paper and in marketing photos, but it means nothing when reality shows up uninvited and unforgiving. Now, when winter storms roll in, I don't lie awake listening for the sound of something about to fail. I don't check weather alerts with a knot in my stomach. I sleep. I wake up. I make breakfast while snow slides harmlessly off the roof the way it was designed to do. My kids play outside again without fear hanging over the house. My wife doesn't flinch every time the wind picks up, and that roof everyone once hated, it's still there. Still ugly to some, still different, still doing exactly what it was built to do. Sometimes standing your ground isn't about winning an argument. Sometimes it's about making sure the people you love are still standing when the storm passes. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?